This video will take a look at demographic theory as an explanation of environmental challenges, and population will be the central focus. So we'll start our discussion by examining some global population trends. We'll look at some demographic trends in terms of fertility and population momentum. Then we'll look more closely at population and its effects on the environment. We'll examine the work of Thomas Malthus, who was one of the early alarmists about population growth, and then we'll look at population as it relates to development, and then we'll finish by looking at the IPAT model and policy. So if we look at global population trends, this particular graph goes back about 200 years, which gives us a window that includes the Industrial Revolution, and within the Industrial Revolution was a widespread movement to cities, and so there was an urban transition taking place. And you can see that this S-shaped curve, there was exponential growth in the population, and that it is forecasted, because the graph does go out into the future, about 100 years, it is forecasted to level off over the next few decades. But certainly the last 200 years has seen an exponential growth of population. Interestingly enough, although it's still growing at a rapid clip in terms of the number of people we're adding each year, the rate of world population growth is actually falling. The annual rate is now about 1.1%, 1.2%, somewhere in there, and the peak, actually in terms of the speed of population growth, was in the 60s. So what we've got is some population momentum that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But problems in terms of population growth have to do with compounding. So even though we're only adding 1.2%, because the sheer number of people on the planet is so large, the amount of time it takes to add 1 million people is much shorter. So more than 90% of the world's current population growth is in poor countries, and that is something that will lead to a discussion of development later on. And so this notion of population momentum has to do with the amount of population we're adding every year, even as the speed of population growth has declined. And so what happens at the country level is that there's a high percentage of people in childbearing years, and particularly women, and that means there's a greater likelihood that more children will be born. And that was the case in the United States in the 60s when we had the population boom, and it's still happening in other countries. And most of those countries today are located either in Africa or Asia. And a third of the world's population in less developed countries is under age 15, which is actually younger than childbearing, which means they stand to see even more growth. And that's why the leveling of global population is projected out into the future. It's not happening just yet. So a large part of population growth has to do with fertility, which is the average number of children born to women in a population. In the year 2000, fertility rates ranged all the way from 5.1, which is a very high number of children per woman to be born, down to 1.7 in wealthier countries. And so development, it turns out, is highly related to the age structure of countries and also to the fertility rate. Overall, the fertility rates have fallen since 1960, as has overall population growth rate, but that does not equal fewer numbers of children due to population momentum. So now let's turn our attention to population and the environment and the relationship between the two. So environmental and social threats posed by exponential growth in population is what we're concerned with. And that means we are growing at it's not a runaway train. I don't think that's an appropriate term necessarily, but if we don't do something about population growth, it could be a compounding problem. And as I'll argue, particularly in another presentation, urbanization is also a process of great concern independent of population effects, although population is certainly going to be a concern for environmental impacts, because the more people you have, obviously the more resources are consumed. But there's a lot more to consumption than just population, as we'll also see later in this presentation. But certainly urbanization does place huge demands on ecosystems, and the distribution of costs and benefits of those demands are not equally shared. So let's think a little more about population theory, and we'll begin that discussion by taking a look at Thomas Malthus. Malthus was writing in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and pointed out that the rate of population growth seemed to be moving at a faster clip than the rate of food growth, and that meant that we were on a path towards disaster. The more people there are, the more resources are needed, and if we can't keep up with the resource demands, then we're looking at famine. We're looking at war. We're looking at what he called population checks. So the question he asked, will the sheer size and growth rate of the human population lead to disaster? And in particular, he was focused on the food supply, although later adaptations of Malthusian thought include resources more broadly speaking. And so the essential argument of Malthus, and a lot of his original argument has been left behind, really came down to a moral argument. He claimed that the poor had a lack of moral restraint that led to essentially too much reproduction, and he really didn't have much optimism that that could be curbed. So he was really in favor of allowing the poor populations to decline due to natural checks, as he called it, which meant essentially starving to death, going to war, killing each other. And so Malthus's initial ideas were quite elitist and anti-poor, and really he despised all forms of welfare policy that would help the poor, because he thought that would just extend the problem, and that was not what he wanted to see happen. So this idea of war and famine as population checks is originally voiced by Thomas Malthus. Malthus was not centrally concerned with environmental outcomes, environmental challenges or problems, but later thinkers would adapt some of those ideas about resource constraint, limited food supply, and population growth. And in the 60s, this was the cause of Paul Ehrlich and some of his colleagues, like Barry Commoner. Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, and later The Population Explosion, and pointed to this idea of the carrying capacity being overshot. The idea that there's a limited number of resources on the planet, it's a finite Earth, and we're outrunning the capacity of the Earth to support the population explosion that is unfolding. And another colleague, Holdren, also voiced concern particularly about technologies and lifestyle. So when you have more and more people adopting destructive technologies, we start to see the problem compounding even more. And so that comes back to that observation we mentioned earlier, that resources are certainly related to population, but resource use is also more than population. It has to do with lifestyle and the kinds of technologies we come to rely upon. So the early thinkers here wound up formulating this handy acronym, equation. Some call it an accounting equation, where essentially the environmental impact, as represented by the letter I, is viewed as a function of population, affluence, and technology. In fact, as a product of those three items. So this impact as a product of population, affluence, and technology points to the fact that we have a lifestyle component. It's not just the number of people that matters when it comes to environmental impact. And of course, impact here has a lot to do with resource demands. So we're not really looking quite as much or as exclusively at things such as pollution, although certainly that is going to be related here. So technology is bound up as a facet of consumption, and of course the push is to make technology greener so that it has less of an impact on the part of those who are concerned about technology. And some of the critics of this model point out that it's really only a national level equation, that it doesn't really help when we're thinking about things on a global scale. And we'll deal with that in another presentation, also another discussion in another place. In terms of technology, of course, this has a lot to do with culture and the idea of lifestyle that we were talking about. There's an interesting idea voiced by Bell and Ashwood about the phenomenology of technology, where essentially the idea of phenomenology is based on the notion of recipes or routines. Right? Human beings are creatures of habit, and we essentially develop ways of doing things that we rely upon throughout our daily lives, and we rarely make major shifts in how we live out our lives and conduct our affairs. And we have a lot of built-in reliance on technology. In fact, as we speak, I've got laundry going in the other room, and that's something that's a technology that uses resources, and people come to rely unthinkingly on a lot of these technologies. And so we have to, if we're going to alter our impact, we have to really think through what kind of technologies we're using, and perhaps make a shift from the dryer to the clothesline, for instance, which is nice if it's not the dead of winter, I suppose. So social organization of convenience is another aspect to this discussion. And that has to do with how we set up our lives around convenience, and a lot of these technologies that we rely on, we do so because of the convenience it offers. Of course, there's a paradox there. While cars may offer us convenience in transportation, they're also a great source of inconvenience when it comes to their upkeep, maintenance, the amount of work it takes to pay for them, and all of that sort of thing. And we can say the same thing about electronic devices. A lot of the technologies that we depend on do provide a certain amount of convenience, but that convenience comes at a cost. And the cost is also seen on its environmental impact. So technology tends to structure our lifestyles. When a new technology comes out, we tend to adjust how we're conducting our lives. Once those adjustments are initially made, we tend to just kind of fall into a routine, as phenomenology would argue. And so we develop a need for culturally adopted technologies. So the idea of need even becomes adjusted here. And ultimately, we see a rise of what Bell and Ash would call passive technological politics, where we uncritically promote particular structures and interests. We start to really, for instance, promote policies and laws that protect car ownership. We unthinkingly subsidize driving through taxation, for instance, paying for roads, when we don't see a similar parallel investment in public transportation in many cases. So all of this is kind of the Malthusian and the Neo-Malthusian examination of population and environment. Now there are critics that we can critiques, particularly of these Malthusian ideas. One of those has to do with technology. And this brings us to the notion of Jevon's paradox. And essentially, Jevon was somebody who studied the efficiency of coal technology in terms of mining and using coal in a more efficient manner. And what he found was, as technologies emerged that increased the efficiency of coal production, those were offset by increases in demand. So the more in other words, Jevon was an early observer of what we're going to call a treadmill of production. The more efficiently we produce, the higher the demand, the faster we have to run to produce more. And so the implication is that while technology may make production more efficient, oftentimes those efficiency gains are offset by still greater consumption, leading to, in the last analysis, inefficiency. And so if we extend that logic out, a popular way of perhaps becoming a more sustainable car owner is to buy a hybrid vehicle. And we see that many hybrid vehicle owners, because of the lower fuel costs that they experience, find it's quite acceptable to live quite a long distance from work. And so they might wind up commuting what amounts to hundreds of miles per day. Simply because they can. So the efficiency of fuel costs is offset by greater consumption. And we see that as a pattern. It's not just limited to these examples. A lot of times when we approve an efficiency, we just wind up abusing that product, feeling as though we're off the hook and having a free lunch maybe, and there really is no such thing as a free lunch. Conflict theory, which we'll examine elsewhere in more depth, is also critical of Malthus, largely because of his attacks on the poor. Again, many of those arguments have been abandoned by the Neo-Malthusians, those who are more concerned about population, who don't necessarily accept the argument that it's the fault of the poor. There is a relationship between development and population that we'll examine more closely, but it is simply too simplistic and really unfair to blame the poor, and we'll examine why that's the case momentarily. Marx and Engels were critics. Of course, they were advocates of socialism and critics of capitalism more broadly, and they ironically were not necessarily advocates of welfare policy either. But they thought that the poor should band together and demand ownership of the means of production and so forth. Feminists were also critical of Malthus because Malthus tended to portray women as passive recipients of reproductive decisions, that there was no empowerment of women voiced by Malthus as a solution to the population problem. And in fact, feminists advocate for that. And really, when we take a look at evidence, for example, there are studies that will take a look at the national level, where women have more education as measured by the percentage of women enrolled in school. You do see a correlation that's very strong with fertility. So the more life chances we give women to have a career, to have an education, the lower the fertility rate tends to be. So the problem, according to feminists, is not so much population as it is gender relations and the disempowerment of women. And development theory, modernization theory, is also not accepting of Malthusian claims about population's infinite growth past the carrying capacity. They theorize a stabilization of population growth that will occur once a certain level of development has been achieved. We'll also see that they're critics of modernization theory. And chiefly those critics happen to be world systems and dependency theory. But essentially what they'll argue is that countries get stuck in a certain level of development as part of the demographic transition towards stabilization that modernization theory argues for. That essentially countries are prevented from developing to the stabilization stages because wealthier countries are exploiting them. And so that's something we'll also explore in more depth, particularly when we look at global political economy. In the end, wealthy countries benefit from the poor nations' excess population because that creates the conditions for cheap labor. You have a lot of people unemployed and a few people who are very nervous about keeping their jobs. You can see how that can add up to a very favorable scenario for companies and countries that want to exploit that for cheap labor. And of course, when you have cheap labor, you also tend to see very lax environmental laws as countries try to court multinational corporations and create a favorable business climate. So let's take a look a little more closely at development just to wrap up this discussion and follow up on some of those observations about modernization and world systems theory. And what we see is population is heavily tied to development. Generally, the more nations develop, and here we're talking primarily about economic development. I know there's a much more and broader way of thinking about that I actually prefer, but here we're referring primarily to economic development. As countries become more economically advanced, their fertility rates tend to fall, and that has a lot to do with the types of occupations and jobs that appear as countries become more economically advanced. And as modernization theorists and feminists and everybody would note and observe, poor countries tend to be agricultural. Agricultural countries tend to demand really large family size. And you can imagine why. If you're running a farm and it's up to you, just you and your family to do that, and you don't have a lot of impressive farm equipment, then you need a lot of hands in the field. And the way you do that is by having a lot of children, or you wind up having to pay workers. So it actually makes sense economically in an agricultural economy to have large families. Now the problem is these are poor countries with a logic that favors huge families. So we're increasing the demands for resources in places that have the least amount of resources. So as we grow economically, we move into things like manufacturing or the service economy, you tend to see the opposite logic, and those two economic structures tend to coincide with urbanization, people moving to cities. And when you move to a city and you have a job in the service sector, say you're an accountant or you work in finance, now you're thinking about family planning is very different, and now kids are more of an economic liability than an economic asset. So fertility declines really tend to coincide with economic developments, and that's really the solution to by modernization standards is to allow countries to grow economically. And as world system theorists claim, that we need to create conditions where that can happen. So development, because it's so heavily tied to population, is also tied to environmental outcomes. And those places that have the greatest amount of population growth tend to be really hitting the resource base the hardest. And not really saying there's an equal problem with population and pollution necessarily, but those things do tend to be correlated. But what we see is wealthy nations get to enjoy the benefits of a stabilizing population, which means that the environmental problems that plagued many of these nations begin to also level off. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to go back in time to pristine days when you had old growth forests and those kinds of things, but certainly the air can clean up, the water can clean up. Maybe there's even money available to remediate places that have been contaminated, as we see with the Superfund program, for example, in the United States. But poor nations undergoing population explosion generally can't afford to have those kind of environmental benefits. So when we think about policies, from a Malthusian standpoint, really the implication is we need to curb population growth. I wouldn't really advocate a orthodox Malthusian position which blames the poor. Neo-Malthusians had some better ideas, and feminists certainly were onto something that's supported by evidence. Remember, we're trying to treat this issue from a social science perspective, so we need to be thinking about where the research points. And in fact, empowering women, sending them to college, giving them jobs, it delays the process of childbearing. If you live in a culture where women are viewed as simply as bearers of children, then generally what happens is they begin to bear children at a very young age, and when you do that, you tend to have larger families. When a woman has her first child at the age of 30, then the potential for having a large family is much greatly reduced, right? So this is important. And then, of course, the Marxian modernizationists and the world system theorists, all these perspectives have to do with development. And the Marxians really examine social class inequality and advocate for helping the poor as a critique of the orthodox Malthusian position. And the development theories say that we need to create conditions where poor countries are able to develop economically, so that the thinking about family planning in agricultural countries in particular can be altered, right? So that it does not seem favorable to have large families. So that means we need to really change the economic conditions. And world systems theory cautions us here that when we're helping the poor countries develop, that we're not using loans and other types of ways of controlling that development, because that can create a debt trap. And we're not going to go into that here, but we'll talk about that when we get to global political economy. Thanks for watching. That's going to conclude our discussion of population environment and how it relates to development. Thank you.